Are you struggling to come up with original content week in and week out? Start a podcast. Interview your ideal clients, let them talk about what they care about most, and never run out of content ideas again. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Hi there, and welcome to the B2B Growth Show. This is John Ruggi, and I host our Category Creation series. I'm also the VP of Marketing Strategy at BombBomb, where we help you make more human connections with the people you do business with through personal one-to-one videos. All right, now, I don't know about you, but when I first got into marketing years ago, I had no idea what the heck positioning was. It turns out positioning is a really important piece of making sure that your audience sees you the right way. And not only that, positioning is something you have to pay special attention to if you're trying to create a new category. That's why today I'm going to talk with Andy Cunningham, who is one of the top thinkers about positioning and also the author of one of my favorite books about the topic called Get to Aha. Andy is going to tell us all about what positioning is, why it matters, and how it plays into your category design process. So without further ado, let's hear from Andy Cunningham. All right, Andy, thank you for being on the show today. It's great to have you here.
Hey, it's really great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you bet. Well, I know many people have heard of you. Many people have read your book, Get to Aha, but I always like to ask my guests to just tell us a little bit more about themselves, maybe some things we don't know about you from the professional profile we always hear.
Okay. Let's see. Well, I was a roller skating hostess in high school. Actually, no, it was college. I was a roller skating hostess for a restaurant in college. I used to play the trumpet. I was a music major in college, and I was a performance classical trumpet player. And I live on a boat in Sausalito.
Wow. Well, I'm actually a former trumpet player myself, which I don't think I've ever mentioned publicly, but...
Awesome.
Yeah.
We all love each other. All the trumpet players love each other.
That's right. A good deal. And you run a marketing consultancy. It's called the Cunningham Collective, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. It's called Cunningham Collective. We're based in San Francisco, and we basically help companies position themselves for success in the market and also help them figure out how to get traction for their new positions.
Great. And then I mentioned this earlier, but you wrote a book called Get to Aha. Anything you want to tell us about that before we dive in?
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing I'd like to say about my book, Get to Aha, is that it is I call it Positioning 2.0. Everybody who's a marketer probably read Positioning 1.0, which was the Jack Trout and Al Reese book that came out in the 70s. A great book on positioning. In fact, they invented the concept. They were very prescient. But that was way before the internet. And no one has written anything about positioning since then. And so I felt that it was necessary to put a real framework behind how you actually do this in the 21st century. And so I would encourage you, if you liked Positioning 1.0, you're really going to like Positioning 2.0 or Get to Aha.
Good deal. Well, I'll have some more questions for you about the book and some of the ideas in there as we get into the interview a little bit further. But one of the questions I like to ask guests on this series is, how do you define categories and how do you define category creation, category design?
Yeah, that is a very big and very important question. First of all, a category, even if you look it up in the dictionary, a category is a group. There is more than one company in it. So it is extraordinarily unusual for a single company to actually create a category. What often happens is a company comes up with something really interesting. They develop a product. They push it forward as much as they possibly can. They run out of money and they die. And then the second company, improves a little bit on that. And it's not till the third or fourth company that can actually say that they have built a category. So I've been involved in many category creations, and they involve lots of companies and they involve lots of failure. And so if you're lucky enough to get the company that's the fourth or fifth or sixth in the lineup with a new idea, then you may have the category king, but you're very unlikely to build a category as the first person going out doing it.
Unlikely to be the first. So you've been involved in this a few times. What are some examples you like to bring up when that's happened, where the first, second, third kind of pioneers out there have kind of fallen by the wayside, and it's someone later on who's kind of picked up the mantle?
Well, no one remembers the ones that fell by the wayside. That's the thing about category building. But you can be sure that the ones that have won in any of these categories that you could talk about, they are not the first ones in there. So the ones I've been involved with, I was involved with the category creation of video games. I worked with Atari. Atari was not the first company to create a video game back in the late 70s, early 80s, but they are the ones who established that category. Then I was involved in the category creation of what was called back then desktop publishing, which is what Apple and Adobe, which actually was a company called Aldus, but Adobe acquired it, created this incredible new thing about how you could actually publish newsletters on your desktop. That was a category of many companies in many different industries created that category, but I was there at the beginning of that. I was involved in the category creation of very light jets, which is a really fun one in the aviation space. I worked with a company called Eclipse Aviation, which invented the category, and 10 years later they died because they didn't have enough funding. And Honda and a few other companies kind of just sat back and watched the failures that we were having at Eclipse and jumped in long after the failure of that company, and they dominate the category today. The Honda Jet is one of the best very light jets out there. So anyway, I've been involved in a lot of these things and seen them come and go. So category creation is a very big deal. Very expensive, can't be the first one in. But if you are the third or fourth one in, you can stand to make a ton of money by building that category.
Sure. So what is it about being the first or the second, do you think, that leads to failure? Is it trying to come to market before the market is really ready? Is it lack of capital to just have the staying power to wait for the market to come on board, or maybe it's something else?
I think it's vision before market is ready is the issue. So a lot of these companies have great visions. I mean, if you think about Apple, where I worked with Apple many years ago on the launch of the Macintosh. If the Apple II hadn't existed to fund the development and failure of the Macintosh in the first few years, the Macintosh would not have happened. It would have died, just like all these other companies. So I think it's very. It costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of patience. And it really helps if you've got some other product that can fund the development of a brand new idea. Visions are wonderful things. They're all over Silicon Valley. But funding the vision and having the vision meet the market at the right time in the right way is a very hit or miss operation.
Sure. And, a couple examples that come to mind for me as you're talking about that are, one, electric cars, which were, I think, invented maybe 100 years ago.
Yeah. Yes.
And then, of course, the one you hear about a lot as well is social media. And there were a couple predecessors in social media before even Facebook, who we've talked about plenty of times, who have since fallen by the wayside. So, yeah, that's a really interesting perspective, because I haven't heard that highlighted, I think, enough in some of the discussions I've had around category design.
Because everybody thinks it's very sexy and successful to build a category. But what they don't realize is that building a category is different from starting a category, right? Creating a category. Mm-hmm. The creation of a category is the thing that is it's like putting a bullet to your head. If you're going to create a category, you're probably going to die.
Right.
In fact, I cannot think of a single company that successfully created the category from the very beginning and still dominates it even 5, 10, 20 years later.
So Salesforce with cloud-based software, they weren't the first company to build cloud-based software.
Absolutely not. In fact, I worked with Hewlett-Packard long before Salesforce ever showed its face on the market, and they had a cloud-based. So, I mean, cloud stuff has been around for a long time. What they did is they popularized it, and they made it cool, and they had that wonderful logo that said "No Software," and they made everybody believe that they were the category creators, but they were not. They built the category. They built their success on the shoulders of people who had failed before them.
Sure.
And that's how you do it. That's how you build a category today. You find a great idea that's out there, and then you put your stuff on top of those shoulders and improve the heck out of it. And that's how you build one. You learn from the people who made the mistakes before you.
Yeah. Is that how you describe the difference between category design and category creation then?
Well, I'd say category design and category creation are probably the same sort of idea. The thing that I would say is different is building a category. Like you can say that you invented the first electric car, right? If you're still alive today, but that doesn't mean that you built that category. It means you invented a new idea that was the very, very beginnings of a category that took 100 years to actually come to fruition.
Sure.
The product market fit wasn't quite there 100 years ago for electric cars. It is today.
Yeah. We talked about positioning at the beginning of our conversation. Let's bring that back into the mix because, they're very positioning and category creation or category design, whatever you want to call it, are related, but they're not exactly the same thing. So what can you teach us about how we should understand those terms and how they relate to each other?
Sure. So I think you need to understand the answer to what both of those are for yourself as a company. So you need to know what category you fit in, and then you need to know what is your position within that category. So to me, understanding your category is a very strategic question. And that is where you have to decide, are you going to join an existing category? Are you going to attempt the death knell of creating a category? Right. Or are you going to create what we call subcategories? That's actually a place where you can maybe make some headway if you're really feeling adventurous. And one of my favorite examples of that is the Dodge minivan. So Dodge, an automotive company, had a problem. They had too many chassis of a certain size, and they basically were suffering from an inventory glut. Somebody inside the company, I don't know who it was, said, hey, what if we don't put the sedan on top of that chassis? We put something else on top of it. Maybe we can sell it then. And they scrambled together a very raw, what is today the minivan, and they put that on top of the chassis, and it got a little bit of traction. People really liked it. Then they started to improve it and make it better. And voila, a few years later, the minivan was born. But that's a subcategory. It was brilliant. It was born out of a problem, like many successful things are. And the fact of the matter is, it still took years to build it. And they couldn't have done it without the funding behind, the funding that Dodge had with other successful vehicles.
Right. And they kind of were forced into that situation, for better or worse, with that glut of inventory that you mentioned.
Yeah.
How do you see subcategories playing out in, say, software?
Well, I think if you can find something where there's a big improvement that is required in an existing situation, I think you can build a subcategory. It's not an easy thing to do, but I think it is possible to do it. So if you take, say, like the whole Adobe suite of marketing products. Everybody loves Adobe, and we all love their product. But they started with a creative product. I forgot the name of it, but they were actually able to establish a market with that. And then what they did is they actually started buying companies, and they started doing their own development and creating sub pieces of that overall thing, until one day they said, wait a minute, what we really have up here is what we're going to call the Creative Cloud. So they actually created all these, I would say, subcategories of the Creative Cloud, but they didn't name the Creative Cloud until much later. And that's when they realized, we have a big category. It's not even a category, it's a product line. And all of these little subcategories that we were trying to build actually fit underneath this Creative Cloud idea.
So would it be safe to say then that if you've built something, whether it's an ecosystem of products or maybe just a point tool, and there's not really a great framework to describe what that thing is in the market, is that where designing a subcategory comes into play?
Yeah, I think that's actually a great way to look at it. Is sometimes you've built something that adds a twist or does something slightly different, and that's why the question of what is the category you're in a really important one, because you need to understand if you are joining, because the marketing is different. If you're joining an existing category, the marketing is different than if you're creating a subcategory. So marketing the Dodge minivan was a very different task than marketing another sedan that looked just like the other sedan before it. That's much more of a commodity marketing situation. Yeah. So I think it's an important question to answer. And then positioning is, okay, now that you understand what category you're in, what's your spot? Where's your place in the sun in that category? What's your differentiator? What is your role? What is your relevance? That's to me what the positioning is. It's the dot on the map inside that category.
So they're not, it's not an either or. You've got to make these two different decisions. One is what category you're going to compete in? Is that
Yes.
finding a niche within an existing category, or does it mean creating and designing a new category or subcategory? And then given that, what's the position
Within the category.
within the category? Right.
Everybody wants to know what category you're in. Like, what are you? Are you cloud-based software? Are you an electric vehicle? Are you a video conferencing system?
Yeah. Tell me more about why that's so important for people to understand in the buying process.
Because of how the mind works, the brain has a very hard time coming up, understanding brand new things that don't fit into all the spaces. Your brain is kind of mapped out to understand things when you see them. When you see something you've never seen before, your brain doesn't know where to put it or what to do with it. So a lot of times what people do, most people, when they're confronted with that, is they push it out and they ignore it. And that's the last thing you want as a marketer, is for people to be ignoring your product or your service. So if you can put it into a place in the mind that people understand, then you've created an affinity for it from the get-go. And that's much better than creating repulsion from the beginning. So you want to try to create an affinity, and you do that by being something that they already recognize. And that is why analogies work so well in marketing. This is the Uber of that. This is the Apple of that. It's because your mind works that way.
Because our world is so complex and there's so many things our brain has to contend with, we use categories as these rules of thumb for grouping things together and knowing what to expect. And like you said, if you don't give buyers context for what that is, they're just confused. And then like the worst thing that can happen is they'll push you away.
It out. So first you gotta create affiliation. And then once you create affiliation, then you can create differentiation. But if you create differentiation before affiliation, you're kind of messed up.
Sure. It's like different from what? If you're just saying you're different, but you don't give context for what you're differentiating yourselves from, or how you're better or cheaper or faster, whatever those characteristics are, then none of that really makes any sense.
Right. There has to be context for people to understand why your product is better than the other ones out there. So if you look at Elon Musk, and he's one of my favorite examples of using his character and his vision as a differentiator, right? So there have been many electric car companies, and there will be many more electric car companies. He was definitely not the first, as we talked about a while ago. But people want to affiliate with him because he's showing them a path to a better future, not only with the electric cars, but with SpaceX and the Boring Company and the neurological thing he's got going. I mean, people want to attach themselves to a visionary like him. And so he uses that to market Tesla. And that's brilliant. I mean, Steve did it too with Apple. He used his own personality. Richard Branson uses it. If you have that kind of a personality and that asset going for you, you might as well, use it to help market your company.
Yeah. Well, that's probably a great segue into some of the principles in your book. You have identified these 3 different DNA types that companies can use to help better understand their own positioning and their own messaging. So can you walk us through what those are? And then I know you've got some, the 6 subtypes, 2 within each. So yeah, I'd love to hear your take on that.
You definitely read the book. Thank you.
Yeah. That's right. It's right here. So.
Thank you. So here's the thing is that companies are a lot like people. So if you sort of go into the whole marketing exercise, understanding that, you're going to be a much better marketer. And the reason they're like people is because they serve people and they're made up of people and they make products for people. So the first principle of all of this is that companies are a lot like people. So within that, I looked at a couple of hundred companies that I'd worked with in the past, and I tried to categorize them to see if there were patterns that were forming. And I spent quite a bit of time doing this, and I wound up with 3 piles on my desk, 3 piles of companies. And there was the companies that were very customer focused, a pile of companies that were very product focused, and a pile of companies that were very concept focused. And then I tried to find other places to put them, and I couldn't find a company that went into a new pile. So once I looked at those piles, I examined what exactly is the same of all these companies in let's say in the customer focus pile. Well, they treat people differently. They hire people differently. They talk about different things in meetings. They structure themselves differently. They measure success differently. They do all these things differently. And then I looked at the things that they do, and I tried to match it up with the product-focused company, and I realized, they structure themselves differently and hire different kinds of people and measure success differently. And the same is true with the concept companies. So that was kind of the beginning of the idea that I have these 3 types of companies. So then, of course, because I'm a marketer, I had to give them nicknames. So I called them mothers for the customer-focused companies, mechanics for the product-focused companies, and missionaries for the concept-focused companies. But I took it one more step and I said, okay, let's say you are a mother company. Okay, how could you position yourself? Once you understand what your DNA is, how can you position yourself with that knowledge? Well, I tried to find more than two, but I could only find two in each of these categories. So if you're a mother-focused company, you can only position yourself around customer experience or customer segmentation. Now, there's a million ways to position yourself within that, but you can only be around a segment like Nike does. Nike is a mother company that focuses on the segment of what they call the aspirational athlete, right? Whereas Disney is a company that focuses on customer experience, and they focus on the experience that their customers have with all of their products, especially their theme parks. If you're a product-focused company or a mechanic, you focus on either features or value. Walmart is a very value-oriented company. Oracle and Microsoft are both very features-oriented companies. And then the third kind, the concept companies, or the missionaries, as I like to call them, and I spent a lot of time working closely with Steve Jobs, so I feel like I have a great affinity for these kinds of companies. They position themselves either around cult of personality, like Richard Branson or Elon Musk,
right,
or they position themselves around the next big thing. They're going to create the next big thing. And if you look at them very, very closely, you'll notice that the next big thing that they come up with is never the first time that next big thing has shown up. Even if you look at the iPod that Apple created, not the first time there was ever an iPod, right? There were MP3 players before that. It's someone like Steve, a visionary like Steve, who can take all of the elements of something that is already out there and add to it, which is what he did with the Macintosh, and create something that feels new but really isn't all that new. And that's just brilliant product market fit stuff, I think.
So yeah, like that example of MP3 players and iPods is really interesting, because I wonder what would be going on in the minds of someone who had, invented some of the predecessors to the iPod, these MP3 players. And I don't know enough about what brands those were, what the product names, but
no, right, because everybody forgot them. Yes.
So is it simply because those companies didn't have the right way to position and kind of sell a vision for those products, or is it something bigger than that?
Well, I think they didn't understand how people were going to use them, and that is the biggest difference. I actually worked with one of those companies before the iPod came out, and I think the name of the company was Sonnet or something like that. I don't even remember the name of the company because they died shortly thereafter. But most of those companies thought that their vision for the product was not so much around music, but it was really more around MP3 players moved into the music. But even before the MP3 players, they were talking about more like what we would call a podcast today, right? Which hadn't been invented at that point. But they saw them as a new way to have radio, right? So they envisioned people using it as more like a radio when you're at the gym, when you're going for a walk. And they didn't understand the positioning, right? So Steve comes out and he says, here's 1,000 songs in your pocket. Like, wow, that's what I want. I want music. I don't want radio because I already have radio. And I want it in my pocket. And it's like the positioning was so brilliant. It's just 1,000 songs in your pocket. It's not all of this technology mumbo jumbo and all of this. So that's why his made it. But then he also reinvented the music industry in order to go with that. So there was other things that had to happen to make that a success. But that was just brilliant positioning.
So there was this category design aspect where he wasn't just building the product; he was building an ecosystem of things around the product to make.
Really good point. Yeah. You got to have the ecosystems. Like he needed the music industry as well as his technology, right? Elon Musk needs the whole supply chain, right? In addition to what he's building, you can't do it alone. So, but the iPod entered an existing category that at the time was called MP3 players. But Steve didn't call it an MP3 player, right? That's not what he called it. He said, I'm just going to call it an iPod.
Right.
So everybody thinks he created that category, but he didn't create that category.
Yeah, and those names became kind of like household names for that product. Like my kids, they've got like these Amazon Kindles, like the kids version. But before that, they had my old iPad. So that's what we called it. And that's what they refer to their Kindles as iPads, even though it's not what they are. Yeah. So you've got there's these three DNA types: missionaries, mothers, and mechanics. I want to ask you about how they relate to category in a moment, but can you just give me a few more examples of companies within each of those? And especially since this is a B2B show, if you can think of any B2B examples, that would be really cool to hear.
Sure. Well, I'll start with the mechanics. So Oracle and Microsoft are the two best examples that I can come up with of B2B companies. Well, Microsoft is also B2C, but they're largely B2B. And they are so much product oriented companies. And by the way, when Bill Gates started that company, he started as a product company, right? He's bought stuff. Most product focused companies, they have one product and then they buy everything else. And then both of those companies are big in the M&A space. So those are great companies like that. In the mother space, that's a little bit more challenging, but here's what's starting to happen. Amazon. Amazon is moving itself from a product company. Actually, first they started as a missionary company, then they moved into product. This is sort of a normal path of operation. And now what they're doing is moving into being a mother company. And they started this process back several years ago when they bought Zappos. And they didn't buy Zappos because Jeff Bezos couldn't figure out how to sell shoes online. They bought Zappos because they were trying to infiltrate the company with that customer centricity, that customer focus that Zappos is so famous for. And Tony Hsieh with his book, Delivering Happiness, is so famous for. So that was the first step that they took in actually becoming a mother company. And they've done many steps since then. And the latest thing they've done, this is probably 2 years old now, is they actually published a new mission statement. And they made a big deal about this new mission statement. And their new mission statement is to be Earth's most customer-centric company. And so you can see that they've made this purposeful steering from where they were to a mother company. And that includes not only their B2C stuff, but also their B2B stuff with, AWS and all of that.
Right. Yeah. If that statement's not a mother-oriented company, then I don't know what would be.
Exactly. And they made a big deal about making sure everybody knew that that was their new mission statement. It's on their website. It's very prominently placed. Most companies don't put their mission statement out there like Amazon has done recently with that. And in the missionary department, that's Salesforce is a missionary. Okay, Mark Benioff, total missionary, total B2B company, took something that was that was struggling already, the whole sort of cloud software thing and the customer relationship management stuff, and he blew it up into this giant thing and became a missionary around how can you build your sales force to be more successful. And I don't even know of a B2B company today that doesn't use Salesforce software. So
Sure.
They were super successful. Yeah. So those are three B2B situations in those categories. And I just one other thing about these categories. Remember I said companies are a lot like people. Well, just like people, when you know what you're made of inside yourself, you can make something of it, right? We always tell our kids, find what you're passionate about, find what you're good at, and then, double down on it. Don't find something that you aren't good at and try to double down on that, because that will never be authentic in the market. Same is true with companies. Find out what you are really good at and who you really are. Are you customer focused? Are you product focused? Or are you concept focused? And then double down on that. And when you do that, your marketing is much more authentic and it feels like it rings true. Like, who would believe that Comcast is a mother company? I mean, who believes their ad campaign out there today about all these great stories they have about customers who are having a great time with Comcast? No one believes it because it isn't who they are.
Right. Yeah, not with a negative NPS score. So DNA, it's really something that you are uncovering, not so much choosing and then pursuing as a direction.
Right. That's right. And if you're a startup company, it's probably going to be the DNA that you brought to the table as the founder. That's probably how it starts. And usually that starts with a missionary kind of idea, not always. Sometimes somebody says, boy, I have this great new product feature and I'm going to build the heck out of a company around it. And then that DNA kind of infiltrates the whole company. So usually it starts with the founder. But as companies grow and mature, they can make purposeful shifts like Amazon is doing. Mm-hmm. Or it's happening to Apple in the market right now. Apple is not purposefully making that shift. But when Steve Jobs died, they lost their missionary, sure. Right? And unfortunately, they were not able to find another missionary. And Tim Cook, who I believe is probably the world's greatest steward of assets that he was left, has spent several years trying to replace the missionary and unable to do so. Meanwhile, the market's pushing them into being a product-focused company. And unfortunately, in my opinion, even though they're super high valued, and I think they've done a fabulous job, they're a little behind the eight ball on recognizing that that's what they are today, that they're a product company today. In fact, I call them an essential luxury brand. They're like Louis Vuitton, except you need your Louis Vuitton, right? You need your if you live your life on iOS, you will pay the extra money for it. and because you think it's a luxury, but you need it. So an essential luxury is a really unusual position that they have in the marketplace today, but they got to make sure their products are working really well.
Right. And a lot of the products they've announced recently, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't describe them as next big things like the Apple credit card, the next
Yeah.
generation of AirPods. Like they're interesting products, they're good products, but they're not like game-changing categories we've never heard of before.
They haven't had a next big thing since Steve died. Since a long time.
Yeah.
And they're not going to. What they're going to do is they're going to continue to evolve those products. They're going to become more of a services company. They're going to try to make themselves essential to your lifestyle. But my big beef on Apple these days actually is that back in the day, the reason that the Macintosh became successful after Steve went back to Apple is because he recognized there was a tribe of people who were so dependent and in love and passionate about the Macintosh. And he tapped into that tribe and then grew that tribe. And it turns out that tribe were creative people. They were the people who think different, right? That was his whole ad campaign. Well, when he discovered that, which he didn't know when he was at Apple the first time, when he discovered that and doubled down on it, he was then able to grow the tribe. Today, 9 years after he died, nobody knows who the Apple tribe is anymore. No one has idea, what is the Apple user? It's like we don't have a tribe anymore. And they need to define who their tribe is and start communicating with their tribe, just like Steve did back when he came and did the Think Different campaign.
Yeah, it sounds like a real challenge when you're, one of the most valuable companies on earth and your tribe is, a few billion people large.
Exactly. It's a big challenge, but I think they're up to it, but I think they have to recognize that it is a challenge.
Sure. So back to your DNA types, one of the points I remember highlighting when I read the book was this idea, this misperception almost that in order to be a category creator, you have to be a missionary. But I don't think you believe that's the case.
Correct. I don't. I think you can build a category. Again, I prefer to use the word build rather than create because I think the creators die. I think the builders thrive. But I think you can build a category as a mother, a mechanic, or a missionary. Many of them have, actually. If you look at Nordstrom is a great example. I don't know if people outside of the West Coast know what Nordstrom is, but it's a retail store out here for clothing and shoes and men's and women's and children's, and it is known for its incredible customer service. Much like Zappos, they're known for their customer service in that regard. And they basically created that. That's what they created. That was their subcategory, was super high-end service for retail. No one else had done that before Nordstrom did. So they created a subcategory within the retail store, within the department store category. And it really took off, and they still own that position today. So,
sure. So, if you have this idea that you want to build a category, you want to build a subcategory, at least some of the startup founders that I've talked to, when I've actually shared this framework with a few of them, and a lot of times I hear, "Well, we want to be missionaries," and it's like, for some reason, I think that like comes across as more appealing, like it sounds more adventurous or interesting. But you're saying like, you can be a mother, you can be a mechanic, you can be product focused, you can be customer experience focused, or focused on a market niche and design a new category. It's just with a different lens than you might if you're doing the next big thing.
Yeah, I think everybody, who doesn't want to be like Steve Jobs or Howard Schultz or Elon Musk or Richard Branson? Of course. I mean, we look up to these people. They're the heroes of our time, right? So of course we all want to be like them. But when you really, just like your viewers can't see me, but I'm 5'3", and I'm stocky, and I do not at all look like a ballerina. So when I was a child, I took a lot of ballet, and I wanted to be a ballerina. But if I look at my DNA, I say to myself at some point when I was like 16, this ain't going to happen. You're not going to be a ballerina. So it's like you have to look at who you actually are in order to make something of it. And so even though everybody wants to be a missionary, you can't pretend you're a missionary if you're not. And just like I couldn't pretend I was a ballerina if I really wasn't. So it's really important to understand who you are. And there's a lot of companies in all three of those categories that have built ginormous industries, right? But not around the idea of being a missionary. So if you happen to be Steve Jobs or Elon Musk, hey, more power to you. You probably will do lots of great things.
Yeah. So would you consider like Larry Ellison or Bill Gates, even though they have high profiles, would you consider them missionaries?
No, I would not. And I know both of them.
Yeah.
And they're both brilliant people, brilliant, but not missionaries.
Okay, cool. So we talked about category, we talked about positioning. I want to talk a little bit about branding because I remember you have a little bit of a bone to pick, and I have the same kind of bone to pick about doing branding in isolation, especially before positioning. So tell me more about that, why it's so important to do branding at the right time with the right context.
Yeah. But it comes from a philosophy that I have, again, about companies being like people. We all do better in life if we think about something before we act, right? The rational side of us is a smarter side. And we do better things if we think about something before we act on it. And then we attach the emotion later. So the same is true with companies. I look at positioning as the rational side of a company, and I look at branding as the emotional side. And you got to have both of them, because just like in a human, we need a rational side and we need an emotional side. We need a heart and we need a head, right? But when you're a company, it's so much easier to lead with the emotion, with the heart, because it's sexy, it's colorful. It's a great thing for a new CMO to do when they come into a company, because it creates a lot of, action and colors and, storyboards and all this sexy stuff. It looks like stuff is happening, right? But what happens is you spend a bunch of money on that, and it's all around the emotional side of it. It's all about the tagline and the colors and the logo and the squishy stuff, as I like to call it, the heart stuff. And then it goes out there, and then you realize, like, sometimes as little as a week later, holy shit, that's not at all who we are, right? That's my dream of the sexy Andy, not my dream of the real Andy, right? So if you actually come out there and figure out who you are first and position yourself rationally, then do the emotional stuff, then you're basing all of that emotions on something that's actually real. And it works so much better. And there's millions of companies that have gone through this exercise only to destroy it later. There's a company called Flex. Do you know Flextronics? It used to be called Flextronics. Now it's called Flex.
No,
It's
I'm
a
not
B,
familiar.
it's a B2B contract manufacturing company, gigantic
Okay.
out here in Silicon Valley. They hired a new CMO about 4 or 5 years ago. He came in, he rebranded the entire company. He changed the name. He went from Flextronics to Flex. They changed the entire advertising and positioning and tagline and everything. They came up with a new tagline. It was called From Sketch to Scale. It was super creative. I know the creative team who did it was 1185 Design. They were brilliant. They launched this campaign, and literally a year later, they killed everything, because none of it was reflective of who the company actually was. And here's how they discovered that, right? They had this notion of sketch to scale, so we will help you at the very small end of what it is you're building. If it's a tiny little software app, all the way on up to if you're building another Apple computer, we'll do all of it. They looked at their revenue and where it was coming from, and zero was coming from the sketch part of it. So the whole promise of From Sketch to Scale was false, because they didn't do any of the sketch stuff. So they basically fired the CEO, they fired the CMO, and they brought in a new team, and they killed all of that. And I don't know, a couple $1 million at least in creative work that was done on that product. And it was brilliant creative work. That's the thing about it. It was brilliant. It just didn't match with the company. It wasn't authentic to who the company was.
Sure. And that work on the creative, or the cost of the creative work, probably pales in comparison to the opportunity cost of confusing the market and making people
Exactly.
not sure of what you're really about.
Exactly. I knew the people who did it. They're brilliant people. It was super creative work. If the company could have changed itself to become that would have been great. But the people that were doing this work didn't have the power to actually change the company from the ground up. They were just changing the marketing. So
Sure.
they were putting the ballerina costume on top of the 5'3" person.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, yeah, that's right. Like if you think about it in terms of maybe like a job interview, you'll have to pick out, of course, something to wear to your job interview. But depending on what kind of position you're applying for and what kind of impression you want to create, you might pick something that looks really interesting and is fun and creative, but it might create the totally wrong impression, or it might not reflect the kind of personality that you're comfortable with. And then you're going to feel awkward wearing these clothes, and it's going to come across, people will see right through it. And it sounds like that's exactly what can happen to a company when they put on this new kind of persona or visual identity, or
Yep.
brand about how they want to look. But if it's not something they're trying to achieve or reflective of who they already are, then it's not going to last.
That's exactly right. So you are so much better off if you just figure out who you are first and then create a position around that and then do all that sexy, fun branding stuff that aligns with that position. You're going to be way better off and you'll be ahead of the game instead of behind the eight ball, which is what happens to all of these companies. But that said, positioning is a rigorous, hardcore examination of who you are. It ain't easy, right? And it's not that much fun. The fun part is all the sexy stuff. So people, when you're a new CMO and you're coming into a company, you want people to notice you. You want to make a difference. You want to see visible change. None of that happens with positioning because it's like, oh, this is my DNA and this is my category and all these questions that are so hard to answer. And nobody goes home at the end of the day and goes, oh my gosh, I'm in the X category. They just, if they don't talk about it at home with their spouse and their family. They talk about the new tagline they came up with or the new ad campaign.
Yeah.
So it's, emotional things are so much more attractive to people, but if they're not based in reality, they're ether. They fizzle into the ether very easily.
So what do you tell a company who is, you can see from the outside that they haven't thought through their positioning?
Yeah.
Maybe it's not even on their radar for whatever reason. And they're getting hung up on the branding side of things or the outward facing things. What do you say to them to kind of change their way of thinking and really get them focused on doing the right things first?
What happens to me and the way I get brought into companies is they've already hired those branding companies and then
Okay.
it's not creating any traction. So I come in after they've already spent the several $1 million or however much money it costs.
Mm-hmm.
And I say, well, this is what happened to you, right? You got seduced by your own language, and that's understandable. But now what we have to do is we have to look at who you actually are and see what of that branding stuff that you've done can we actually, can we use some of it or do we need to toss all of it if it's not based in reality? So I don't usually get a chance to see them before they've already made that mistake. So that's one of the reasons I wrote the book is I really want people to think about this before they take action because it saves time and money and market leadership, right? It's like you can't go out there and pretend you're something and try to build a leadership position on it, then have people discover that it's not true, and then you have to fall from grace and start all over again.
Right. Well, what's your advice for an earlier stage company who doesn't have millions to spend on branding, positioning, consulting, any of that? They're just trying to get started and get the right foundation in place. How should they think through positioning? Should they still try to bring in someone from the outside because you have that unique, more objective perspective? Should they try to do it themselves? What have you seen?
Well, I think for startup companies, branding is less important, right? Because you just have to identify who you are and why you matter, right? That's the most important thing for a startup company. And then later you can add the pretty stuff that goes with it. But I would advise startup companies to either, if they really don't have any money, just read the book and follow the methodology, because that will give you a lot of information. It helps to have an outside person who's been through that a bunch, like I have,
Mm-hmm.
Where I can actually help companies, connect the dots, because really what you're doing with my methodology is you're creating a bunch of new dots, right? And then you have to connect them into a logical conclusion. But it doesn't cost much money to do that, right? You just follow that methodology. But really, if you can answer the question for yourself as a company, who are you and why do you matter? You've got the answer, right? So whatever methodology you use to get through there, whether it's my book or somebody else's, those are the two questions you have to answer. Who are you as a company and why do you matter? And if you can answer those two questions, you understand what your position is. And then you can do the fun taglines and color palettes and logos and all that cool stuff.
Yeah, because that's going to reinforce who you are and why you matter through
Exactly.
visual and other means.
Any good designer will tell you we want the logo of the company should reflect the company, right? That's kind of the idea. Form should follow function. That's a big design premise. But so many people don't understand that. They're so seduced by the fun and the glitz of creativity. But positioning is not a creative act. Positioning is a rigorous thought process that involves research and understanding of what's going on in the market. It's not as exciting. It's kind of boring. It's hard work. It's like understanding what your personality is. Like, are you an INTJ if you look at the Myers-Briggs thing, or ENTP or whatever the heck it is you might be? Like, examining that with yourself takes some hard work.
Yeah. You mentioned doing a lot of work to research the market. In the work you've done, do you tend to do a lot of first party research? Do you rely on other information you find? Do you use like surveys, interviews? What's your process look like for that?
We basically use all of that. So what we're trying to look at is the landscape that a company is putting itself in. So that landscape has a number of things in it, right? And those are the 6 lenses that I talk about. A landscape that you're putting yourself in as a company, it includes, the community that you're serving, which includes your customers as well as their influencers. It includes the category that you're in. It includes the context in which you are doing this. Like doing something today is very different from doing it 20 years ago. The competition is another critical piece of it. Your DNA, the core DNA, is another piece of it. And then the sixth lens that we look at is how would you define a successful positioning statement? We call that criteria. So we want you to figure out what your criteria is for a great positioning statement before you actually write it, so you don't get seduced by some sexy tagline. So anyway, we look at the landscape that you're launching into, and we use that in our favor, right? There are contextual waves that you can ride. So you want to figure out how to ride one. Like if you're a software company today, you wouldn't, and you're not in the cloud, you're not going to get any traction with anyone, right? Because that's the contextual wave that we are in right now. It's all about cloud delivery. So you have to be a cloud company. So it's stuff like that we look at and help companies figure out how to position themselves within each of these lenses so that they can stand out. Because your brain notices what's different within a context of a category. So
really thinking through just what's, like you said, the context of the market that you're trying to serve. How do you define the company internally? What's it made of? And then how do those two relate to each other? That all feeds into your positioning and all the work that extends after that.
Yeah, exactly. So, we try to figure out, where are you the same? That's the category. Where are you the same as everyone else? And once we understand where you're the same, then how can you stand out within that sea of sameness, as people like to call it?
Sure. All right, Andy, we are almost out of time, but I want to ask you if you have any other advice you want to leave marketers or executives, anyone thinking about messaging and positioning, any other advice you want to leave with them today?
Sure. Just two things. One is alignment is critical. So everyone in the company has to be aligned on what the messaging is, because you don't want one person saying one thing and another person saying something else and another person saying something else. So alignment is critical. And then positioning is critical, right? You need to own a position, because if you don't own it, somebody else will. So the idea is create alignment among your executive team and on the messaging, and then own a position. And with those two things, you can go a long, long way. You don't need a lot of money.
All right. So create alignment, own a position. Good advice to end with. What's the best way for one of our listeners to get in touch with you?
We have a website. It's called Get to Aha. We have 2 websites, CunninghamCollective.com and GetToAha.com. I have a book that I'd love for you for people on your listenership to check out and buy, because now I'm in the book selling business. It's available on Amazon. It's called Get to Aha. And that's probably it. I'm on social media. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter. So I'm Andy Cunningham 4 at Twitter.com.
Andy Cunningham 4. All right.
There's 4 of us.
Good deal. All right. Well, Andy, thank you so much for being with me today. I learned a ton from you. Really appreciate you being on the show.
Well, thank you, John. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay. Well, that wraps up this episode of the Category Creation Series. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that this episode helped you in some small way to become a better marketer. Now, if you want to get in touch with me, you can just head to john.marketing in your browser, or of course, you can find me on LinkedIn. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.
I hate it when podcasts incessantly ask their listeners for reviews, but I get why they do it, because reviews are enormously helpful when you're trying to grow a podcast audience. So here's what we decided to do. If you leave a review for B2B Growth in Apple Podcasts and email me a screenshot of the review to james@sweetfishmedia.com, I'll send you a signed copy of my new book, Content-Based Networking, How to Instantly Connect with Anyone You Want to Know. We get a review, you get a free book. We both win.